Hey guys, hope you're doing well. Today I'm going to show you how I build a hatchling rack system for baby ball pythons. So get ready, let's dive in. One of the benefits of doing a DIY rack is you get to build it to the way you want it. So you get to build it to your specifications and you can really customize it by using the materials, the size, the heating element, um, you know, the tubs that you want to use. So whatever becomes available, whatever's cheap, you get to save some money. Yeah, I'm going to be customizing this rack for my needs. Of course, at the end of this video, you should be able to create the same rack, but I'm going to show you how to measure the bins so that you can create one to fit your needs and the space that you have allocated. So first, I found that these bins are readily available in my area, so this is the kind that I'm going to get. The reason I chose this, again, is because it's readily available, it's cheap, and because it's so available and so cheap that if it ever gets dirtied or broken or scratched up, I can just toss it out and get a new one. So, so that's something to think about when choosing the bins. Now these bins, they do come with a lid. I don't need them, so I'm not going to show them. But as you can see here, they do come with the size on the label. However, I found that they're not very accurate, and like the width and the height does include the lid. So what we have to do is we have to measure this very accurately. Now what I plan to do after I build this rack is to place it on top of an existing rack. So I definitely don't want this rack to be any wider or longer than the existing rack, which is why I have to work within the confines of the existing rack's footprint, which I believe is around 46 inches by 16 or 17 inches. I'm going to have to double check. I'm not really concerned about the width. Because I know this here is only about 13 inches, so I know the width is going to be less than the width of the new rack for these bins is going to be less than the existing rack. But I just have to make sure that, when I do the length, of the new rack, that it is the same as the existing rack. And again, I think it's about 46 inches, but I'll double check. So the way I go about measuring it is I take the measuring tape, and what I need to do is I measure the width. So this bin is fairly small and it's fairly stiff, so I'm pretty sure that no matter where I measure it, it's going to come out to be very similar. But if you do have a flimsy bin, or if it's very long, like a 41 quart bin or something, you might want to take multiple measurements. So you might want to take one here, right, and then you want to take one closer to the middle, because the larger the bins are and the more flimsy are, the more they bow out, especially at the store, since they've been stacked one on top of the other. The ones near the bottom are more prone to being bowed out. So you do want to take the largest or the widest part of it. So in this case, it's going to be in the middle. So this is coming out to be 7 and 5/8 of an inch. So I'm just going to go ahead and write that down on a piece of paper. The width is 7 and 5/8 of an inch. Alright, so next up we're going to measure the length. And this is coming out to be just shy of 13 and a half. So I'm going to go ahead and just round that to 13 and a half. So we have the length is 13 and a half inches. Now the height is the most important. It has to be absolutely accurate. And to do that, you'll see that some bins may have a little lip where the corners are taller than the front. So basically the side is all the same height, and then when it gets to the front, there's a little corner, if you can see that. And then so it dips down, and then the other side in the corner it goes back up. So you'll want to account for that. Make sure you measure the highest point. So in this case I'm going to be measuring using the sides to measure the height and not the front here, because this is obviously lower. So to do that, and you also notice that this isn't square, there's a little curve here. So one trick I found is you take something that's straight, this is just a piece of scrap material, and what you can do is you can lay it on top like this. So now you have it touching this corner, well, this point and these 2 points of the side lips of the bin. So now all you have to do is you take the ruler, your measuring tape, and you can measure from the table to the bottom edge of your straight piece of material. So this is coming out to be just a little bit more than 4.5. I would say 4 5/8. So again, I'm just going to mark it down. So the height is 4 5/8 inches. Alright, so now that we have the width, the length, and the height of the bin, and I did confirm that the existing rack has a length of 46 3/4, so that's the limit of the length that I have to stay within for my new rack. I designed the new rack so it's going to look like this, and as you can see, we're going to have one sheet. This will be the second sheet, this will be the third sheet, and this will be the fourth sheet, which is the bottom. Then we're going to have a side panel, 5, 6, and then I want to have these dividers to act as additional support. So there's going to be 7, 8, 9. So there's going to be a total of 9 pieces of PVC material that we need to cut. Now I've gone to the local home improvement store and I found PVC material, and it comes in a sheet of 48 by 96. It's actually a little bit more than 48 and it's a little bit more than 96. I think, you know, the manufacturers probably account for the fact that you'll be cutting them, so there'll be some materials wasted due to the saw cuts. But for ease, let's just assume it's 48 by 96. So ideally, I would want to cut all these pieces, all 9 pieces, from one sheet, which is why it's important to kind of lay it out, draw it out, so that you have an idea of how you're going to go about cutting it. Now, we want to know the dimensions of each of these pieces. So to do that, we're going to use the numbers that we gathered. So we know the overall length is 46 3/4. That's the overall length, right? Which accounts for depth of this sheet and this sheet. And by the way, the PVC material that I'm using, it has a thickness of 1/2 inch. So that's the depth. That's why I said there's a thickness of here and here that we have to account for. And since they're both 1/2 inch, then this piece of material and that we have to cut for this top, the length of this is not going to be 46 3/4. It's actually going to be 46 3/4 minus 1/2 minus 1/2. So that's going to give us 45 3/4. So that's going to be the length of this sheet. And now we have to calculate the width of this sheet. So that's going to be front to back of the entire shelf. So the way I want the bins to lay in the shelf, just imagine this piece being the shelf. I want the bins to slide in this way. Okay, so that actually means this side of the bin is going to determine the width here from front to back. Okay, so we've measured this to be 13.5. Now, if you made that sheet exactly 13.5, it means that your bin is going to sit right like that, very close to the edge. It's actually going to be flush to the edge right here. You might want it like that, but for me, I like the bin to be in a little bit further. So I'm going to round up the 13.5. I'm actually going to add a half of an inch to it. So I'm going to call that 14. So this will be 14. So now we know this sheet, this sheet, this sheet, and this sheet. 4 of these sheets are going to be 45 by 3/4 by 14 inches. So what I'm going to do now, since I know we need 4 sheets, and I purposely determined the dimensions of the largest sheets first. So let's just say, let's pretend we want to cut 14 pieces like this. I'm sorry, 4 pieces like this. And the width is going to be 14. And the length is going to be 45 3/4. Right, so we'll have about 2 1/4 inch of material that's going to be wasted. So each of these is 45 3/4. And there'll be a little bit of waste. So next, let's figure out the dimensions for the 2 side panels. Well, since this edge is going to be aligned with the edge of this side panel is going to be aligned with the edges of the top and the shelves, we already know that it's also going to be 14 here. Now the height here is going to be a little bit hard to figure out because we'll have to do some math. So the bin's height is 4 5/8. So the interior height in here is going to be 4 5/8, maybe. If we did it at 4 5/8, that means inside the shelf, imagine this piece of scrap being the top of the shelf, is going to sit just like that with no gap, no room for error. And if it swells up a little bit with heat and cold, it might get stuck or it might get very tight. You also account for the fact that you might have heat tape going underneath the bin, sitting on the shelf below it. So what I like to do is give it about a 1/8 inch of a gap. That means I'm going to take our height that we've measured, 4 5/8, and I'm going to add 1/8 of an inch gap, giving me 4 3/4. By the way, we added half of an inch up here, so that gave us 14. So now we know that the interior height of each of these shelves, and there's 3 of them, is going to be 4 3/4. 4 3/4, 4 3/4. So we can add them up. So 4 3/4 times 3, that's going to give us, let's see, 14.25 or 14 1/4. So that's interior. But you also have to account for the thickness of each of the shelves in the top and the bottom. So this is half of an inch, half of an inch, half of an inch, and half of an inch. That comes out to be 2 inches. So we want to add 2 inches to this. That's going to give us 16 1/4. So that's what we have. The height of this is actually going to be 16 1/4. Now that we know the dimensions of the side panels, 14 by 16 1/4, let's just assume that it's going to look something like this, the 2 side panels. Again, that's 14 here, 16, did we say 16 and a quarter or 16 and a half? 16 and a quarter. 16 and a quarter. This will also be 16 and a quarter. This will be 14. Alright, so now we got our two side pieces. That's piece 5 and 6. Lastly, we need to determine the 3 dividers that I want here. Again, we can have them run from front to back, so we know from front to back is actually 14. And then what we have for the height, and we know the interior height is 4 3/4. So that means we're going to need 3 pieces that are 14 by 4 3/4. Now I think I can get away with 3 pieces in here. And there still might be a little bit room for scrap. So these are going to be, again, 14 long each and 4 3/4 tall. So now I know I have laid out all the pieces, and it appears like they fit. Let me do a quick, well, all these pieces are going to add up to be less than 48, right? And along here, even though it looks like I have some scrap because it's not drawn to scale, just do a quick gut check and make sure that these dimensions up here don't add up to be greater than 96. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pieces of 14. 14 times 5 comes out to be 70. Yeah. So from here to here is 70. And as you can see, it falls below 96, which means we have about 26 inches of scrap. And we can use that for another project later. So now we can take our plans here, our cutting plans here, take this to the home improvement store, grab a piece of material off the shelf and have an associate cut it. And then we'll keep this diagram here so that we can remember how we're going to assemble it. Now there are going to be other materials and supplies that we need, but I'll show you what they are during the assembly. So here's the equipment that I'm going to be bringing with me to the home improvement store. I have a large metal ruler, some clamps, some extra batteries, tape measure, and cordless circular saw. Alright, it's time to head over to the home improvement store and get some supplies to build a new rack. Alright, I'm inside the home improvement store and I have selected to use PVC to build the racks. The material I'm going to be using are these 1/2 inch 4 foot by 8 foot PVC sheets. You can also use 3/4 inch sheets, but I think these are a little thick and I want to keep the weight down. So I'm going to pull a couple of these and get them cut. Alright, so I got all the materials, paid for them. Obviously this is a lot more than I need for the shelf that we're building. So I got more material for other shelves that I'll build in the future. But for today, there's only probably 1/3 of these pieces will be used for the shelf that we're going to be building. And I park all the way out here where there's no cars because I'm going to be doing some cutting on my own. There's a few little small cuts that I want to make, and it's just easier to do it out here in the parking lot than to cut it in my basement and then have to clean up afterwards. So I'm going to get to that right now. Alright, so I've gone ahead and switched out the cart for this flat cart, so it's going to be serving as my workbench. And I like to make these cuts in the parking lot so we don't get a mess at home. I've gone ahead and made a mark, and then I'm going to use the ruler as my straight edge as a guide. So when I make a cut right here, it's going to cut right on the line. So I'm going to go ahead and make all these cuts, and then we're going to go home and assemble the rack. So let's go over the supplies and tools required to put together the PVC shelves. First we have 1/4 inch screws, Phillips head, and then we have paint stirrers, which I'm going to be using as spacers. I'll show you that in a moment. Then I have a driver with a Phillips bit and a drill with a drill bit that is sized appropriately for the screws. And lastly, I have a 90-degree ruler. Let's just quickly review the PVC pieces that we have. On the bottom, we have 4 large sections, which are going to serve as the top, bottom, and inner 2 shelves. And then we have on the left top, we have 2 pieces that are going to serve as the sides. And on the right top, we have 3 dividers that are going to also serve as support. And you can see there's a little notch that's cut out. That's to accommodate the heating element, which I'll explain later. So I usually start with the bottom piece, and I lay the bins on top and use the paint stirrers as spacers, as you can see here. This will provide support for the next shelf. Next, I dry fit these 3 pieces together. Now they're not fastened, and the side piece is not 90 degrees or perpendicular to the shelves, but the shelf that I added in there serves as support for that side piece to lean on while I fasten it to the bottom. Fastening the side panel to the bottom is easy. First, we make a pilot hole. Next, we drive in the screw. We repeat the steps for the other side. During assembly, I felt the spacer would provide too big of a gap, so I removed the spacers, and instead I'm using just a piece of cardboard, which is slightly thinner than 1/8 of an inch, and I'm going to use that as a spacer instead. Now I'm going to use this 90-degree ruler to make sure that the bottom and side panel are at 90 degrees to each other before I fasten them together. Get your panels as close to 90 degrees as possible. Now drill your pilot hole. And fasten it with the screw. Repeat the process on the other side. Now we add on the next set of bins, spacer, and shelf. Drill your pilot holes and fasten with screws. Now I work my way up to the top with more bins, spacers, and the top. More pilot holes, more screws. One side is completed. Now repeat the process for the other side. Now that the main shelf is completed, let's set it aside so we can work on the heating component. Now let's go over the items I will use to assemble the heating component. First, I have a roll of flex tape. This is 3-inch flex tape. There's 12 feet of it. I have 3 extension cords, electrical tape, scissors, and a soldering kit which consists of a soldering iron, flux, and solder. Let's start by cutting the flex tape. You'll want to cut the flex tape to length, and for length you should measure the inner length of the shelf. Remember to cut in the white area. Do not cut the black bands. Next, we'll take the extension cords and cut off the socket end. You'll notice the extension cord has two wires. We'll need to split them and then expose the ends in order to prep for soldering. So here I'm just exposing about 1/2 inch, and then to keep this bundle of copper together, I'm just going to twist them so they're nice and neat. And we'll do that to all 3 extension cords. Now let's heat up the soldering iron. First, what I need to do is, while the soldering iron is hot, expose the copper that's on the heat tape. And I'll do that just simply by melting the plastic away just a little bit. Now that the copper on the heat tape is exposed, set it aside and let's prepare the wire for soldering. In order to do that, we have to dip the wire into the flux, get a little bit of the flux onto that copper, and now we can get a little bit of the solder. Now we repeat with the other end. Now that both ends are prepared, we can solder the wire to the heat tape. Again, we would need to put some flux on the wire. Place the wire in position. There's one. There's two. Now just repeat the process for the other 2 pieces of heat tape. Now we're back in the snake room. As you can see, the rack that we made is sitting perfectly on top of the existing rack. I put in all the tubs just to make sure that they fit. I also dry fitted the dividers that I showed you earlier. I'm going to be removing them when I install the heat tape. It's important for me to tell you that what you're looking at right now is what I have determined is going to be the back of the shelf. I have it facing me so it's easier to work. The reason it's the back is because when I assembled it, I noticed there were chips and rough marks. When I assembled it, I made sure that all the rough marks and the chips and scratches all face the same direction, and that's the side that's going to be deemed as the back. Once the heat tapes are all installed and I put on a back, this whole shelf is going to get spun 180 degrees so that what you're seeing now will be the back, and the side that's facing the wall is going to be facing the front. So what I've done is I've removed all the bins, and I also removed the support on the bottom shelf, and in place I just left one bin. Now before we tape the heat tape to the shelf, now is a good time to go ahead and use the electrical tape and cover up all the exposed copper, this end as well as the end that we soldered. Now I can go ahead and tape this to the shelf. To do that, I'm going to use foil tape. It has good adhesion and it also helps to disperse the heat. So now is a good time to cut the wires. The length is up to your personal preference. Just be sure to save the cut off piece because we're going to use it later. What I've chosen to use as the back are these boards that you can get from the home improvement store. These are plastic corrugated boards, and as you can see, the structure is very similar to cardboard, except these are made out of plastic. So this just can get cut to size with an X-Acto knife, a utility knife, or even a pair of scissors. So I'm going to go ahead and cut this, and then I'll show you how to install it. Now that the back has been cut to size, I'm holding it up with some good old-fashioned painter's tape. Now all I have to do is fasten it, and to do that we're going to use the same screws as we did with the shelves, making sure to drill pilot holes and then driving in the screws. Once all the screws are fastened, we can remove the painter's tape. And now what we have to do is drill holes for where the wire is to pass through. I'm going to be using a 5/16 inch drill bit. However, you'll use the appropriate size drill bit for however much wire you have. I like to drill my wires on this side. So in order to do that, I'm going to first mark where the holes are going to be. Now to mark the holes, I've inserted a flashlight into the shelf on the other side and turned off the room light. Now you can see an outline of the shelf. And I'm just going to use a Sharpie to mark where the hole will be. Just like that. And I'll do that to the other shelves. And then we'll drill the holes. And then one here. And now we can drill the holes. Now there's one more thing that we need to do before we can spin the rack around and work on it from the front, and that is to install the probe that comes with your temperature controller. So we're going to take the probe and then pass it through the same holes that we drill for the wires. Now I'll flip the rack around and we can work on it from the front. Here's what the rack looks like after it's been spun around. As you can see up top, there's already 3 controllers that are controlling the bottom 3 existing racks, and then there's 3 controllers that are off right now, and those are the ones that we're going to be hooking up. They're the same STC 1000 heat controllers that I used on my incubator, so check out that video for a diagram of how to hook it up. But those are you who like to watch and learn, here's basically how you do it. You take a short section and cut it so that we can split these into half. And first you'll take one of them and then just expose about a little less than 1/2 inch of the copper. A 1/4 inch to 1/2 inch is fine. Twist that, set this aside. Take the other half, cut that in half again. Again, expose both ends of each of these. So now what you're left with, 2 short pieces and 1 long piece. Now on the STC box there's actually a diagram. We're going to be using ports 1 through 6. With the wires that we just cut, you're going to insert one of the short wires into port 1, the long wire into port 2, and then the third short wire we're going to insert into port 5. And to do that, there's screws here. We simply unscrew it, insert the wire, and then tighten up the screw. Now we can hook up the STC to the power source and to the heaters. So now I have so many shelves and so many controllers, I decided to number them in order to keep track of which controller controls which shelf. So I have numbers starting from the bottom, 1 all the way up to 6. So those numbers correspond to these numbers on the controllers. So the first 3 were for the bottom 3 existing shelves. And now we're going to hook up the 3 new controllers for the 3 new shelves. Alright, so let's get started. First I'm going to grab one of the wires. And I've marked that wire. with 3 dots. I know the 3 dot goes with this controller. So I'm just going to cut this open. I'm going to strip the wire, expose about 1/2 inch. Same thing on the other side. I'm going to set this aside and go grab the plug. So here's the plug. This is the part that we snipped off. Remember, I told you to keep this, and this is now when we're going to use this end. So again, we have to split it. And again, we are going to expose some of this copper. On each of these controllers, remember I showed you how to hook it up. What I've done is I've just used some nuts, and these are just twist-ons. These nuts are going to be used to attach the wires together. So the end that is connected to your heater, one of those ends is going to go into port number 6. We loosen the screw that's inside. Insert the wire, make sure it's nice and neat. We don't want any exposed wires. Insert that into port 6 and then tighten it up. The other end of the heat gets attached to the long wire that we attached. So that goes like that. And now the plug side. Doesn't really matter which one you use. You're going to attach one of the plugs to here. Twist them together. Lock them up with one of these connectors. There we are. And then this is the other end of the plug from here. This is the other end, and we will lock this up to this side. And now it's connected. Hey guys, I noticed my hand went off the screen when I was showing you how to put this together. So I'm going to show you real quick when it's all assembled. Basically this wire right here goes to the plug, and you can see that it's attached to the 2 short wires with the nut, and then the other one, this down here, that's to the heater. Like I said, one of them goes to port 6, and then the other wire goes to the long one as well as the one from the plug, so the 3 remaining ones. So just repeat with the other 2 controllers, and I'll get right back. All the controllers are hooked up and labeled. I also labeled the plugs. There's one last thing we have to do before we plug them in. And the last thing we need to do is tape the probe to the heat tape. As you can see, the probe is here. I've already placed the tape on it, and you have to make sure the probe touches the black strips that are on the heat tape. So the last thing to do is just make sure we adhere it. There's one. That's number 2. And lastly, number 3. We're almost done. The last thing we need to do is glue the dividers into place. And to do that, we're going to be using PVC cement. All you have to do is dab a little bit on the top and the bottom along the entire divider, then slide them back into place and let them set. The PVC cement does give off some fumes, so do this in a well ventilated area. I'm going to be using my vent system, so it's going to get a little bit loud. For that reason, I'm not going to be putting that part into this video. So I think the rack turned out pretty well. The only thing left to do is to leave the controller on, the heater on, and make sure everything is stable before adding any hatchlings into the rack. Overall, I'm fairly pleased. I'm actually very happy that we built this together and I was able to share this with you. Hatchlings going in here are going to be very happy. I hope I was able to provide some inspiration and courage for you guys to go and tackle a project such as this on your own. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like. If you have any questions, please comment down below. I'll try to answer them as best as I can. If you want to be notified of future videos, hit the subscribe button and I'll see you next time.